I saw video. Turn right around. Oh, that's the worst. Well, that'd be nice. Yeah, yeah. Right, yeah,
All right, for the record, we have 7 or 8 board members. We have Maddie, Shannon, Catherine, John, Lou, Steve, Dan is on. And that's, well, he's not a voting board member.
Michael Ann is on.
Michael Ann is on. All right, then we have a quorum. Okay. All right, our first item is, of course, call to order at 12:03. And we will have, and is there any public comment on this item, on anything not on today's agenda? All right,
And it looks like he might be wanting to make public comment.
Travis,
Yes,
did you want to make public comment?
yes, please, if you would allow.
Yes, of course. We take it at the beginning of our meeting.
Excellent. My name's Travis Bedell. I'm the president of the Routt County Rifle Club, and I've been in contact with the Yampa Valley Housing Authority for approximately 2 years, almost 3 years now, on a fence project that's been proposed. It's been discussed. It's been talked about with Jason Peasley and Elliot Lawrence. And we've attempted many times to come to a resolution as far as safety concerns that the Rifle Club has in regards to public access and the fence being a necessity for safety and security. The last proposal that the Rifle Club gave to the Yampa Valley Housing Authority was that we trade quitclaim deed for some land so that the Rifle Club would pay for the entire fence project. And there's been no movement in the last 3 years with relations with Jason Peasley and Elliot Lawrence. So it's come to our position now where we're going to go ahead and build the fence on our property for the sake of mitigating these safety concerns. And with the inaction on the housing authority's part, it's long past due that we move forward with this project.
All right, since this is public comment, we take no action, but we will defer it to staff. Jason is attending remotely and Elliot is here. So to the extent I'm going to ask them to get back with you, and if there's any movement, they will send an email. And I would also ask our attorney to be involved since there's a quitclaim deed that's under discussion.
Kathy, I would like please to have Jason and Elliot please update the board after the conversation with Travis, just so we know what's going on with that, so we can have an update from the board.
Perhaps a memo?
Yeah.
Is that what you would think?
Yes. I just think that we need to, and thank you for coming, Mr. Bedell.
Yes, thank you.
So just give the board an update of what's happening, what the status is, what's the game plan moving forward.
I think that's a reasonable request. Okay. All right. Thank you, Travis.
Thank you.
Any additional public comment? If not, we'll move to board member comments. Any comments?
I have one comment.
What's that?
I was just informed that Senator Bennett will speak on our behalf to the Forest Service, hopefully today.
He will speak where?
I think he's in Washington.
In Washington?
Yeah.
Okay.
I was gonna say, he was bummed that Jackson got ahead of us, so it's like, how did Jackson, Wyoming beat us on getting their contract done?
Oh, Jackson, Wyoming, not Jackson County.
Right.
Okay.
So, and I have a comment too. Since Sandy's here, I want to give a super congrats and cheers to Riley. This is so exciting.
You know, it is exciting.
So
Thanks.
keep us posted if your time schedule ahead of us. So,
Okay.
yeah,
Yes, I'm not great at social media, but I'll try.
very exciting.
All right. Then we will, yes, John.
One comment, I was curious about, I know I'm getting ahead of the ball probably here, but in, I think 28 our 1 mil levy expires roughly. And that's only a few years off, and I think we need to start doing some discussion about that and how we're gonna plan for it, because it's not gonna be an overnight thing. It's gonna be long and drawn out, and we have to decide what we're gonna do. I talked to Cole about that a little bit, and he gave me a outline of the pros and cons of no mill and mill, and either both of them have kind of a downside and an upside. And I'd like to have that discussion start soon. And I was told that you and Jason were the people I need to talk to.
Yes. And Cole and I the finance team is working on a spreadsheet to show what would happen with a mill levy, no mill levy, a partial mill levy. So we will be presenting that in February.
Because he answered that same question that you may have asked. And he did an excellent job in 3 paragraphs explaining it to me, even though I'm just got here. So I think that's done really well.
Okay, well, this will be information. It will not be a decision.
I know.
Okay,
We
this will
need to-
be a process.
Right. We need to keep going on the process.
Yes.
I think
Yes.
that's-
And that's going to be at the retreat, Kathy.
No, it'll be in the we'll present the spreadsheets in February. We can have further discussion at the retreat in March.
Okay.
All right. We will move to the primary topic today, or one of two, and that is, George, are you on the line?
I am Kathy.
Would you like to take us through the request for the board to approve a document as it pertains to Cottonwoods?
Yes, ma'am. As you all saw on Friday, we were presented with, and after some back and forth, there is the proposed unanimous consent document that was attached to that email that is between Steamboat 6732, our partners in the Cottonwoods project. This document authorizes the joint venture entity to enter into a line of credit with Steamboat Partners and their owners for up to $4 million. This concept has been discussed previously with the board, including at the last board meeting with the status of Cottonwoods and also with the broader global agreement discussion. And so this would commemorate and authorize that action. The terms of the loan are not specified, but it must be on terms as favorable to the joint venture entity as those of the existing construction loan with Alpine Bank. As discussed in some further detail at the last board meeting, this line of credit, being a loan rather than a capital contribution by Steamboat Partners, would alter the contemplated dynamics of the payouts from the proceeds of the sales from the condo units. This line of credit would be superior or in front in the line for any other disbursements other than the Alpine Bank loan. That would reduce potential proceeds to go to the contemplated developer fee to be split between the Housing Authority and Steamboat Partners, and also reduce the amount of potential money to be used to return the initial capital contributions for both parties involved. This document does not speak or contemplate the need for an additional $5 million. This is a separate thing. So the final result of where the parties would end up with respect to the developer fee and the capital contributions can't be fully analyzed without, an agreement on how additional money we know needs to come into the company would be handled. But if we agree to this, which we've been discussing, this would reduce potential money going to the housing authority. The unanimous consent also talks about a separate issue, which is the infrastructure loan, which is currently encumbering Lot 2, i.e. Phase 2 of the Cottonwoods project. As we've previously discussed, there's been infrastructure improvements constructed on Lot 2 that were necessary pursuant to the development approvals for Lot 1 construction. That is an existing loan against that separate property. The loan is in the name of the apartment joint venture entity, which YVHA is the 99.9% owner of. However, Steamboat Partners and various members thereof are personal guarantors on that loan. Alpine Bank we have discussed both with you all, the Steamboat Partners, Alpine Bank, the concept of removing them as guarantors on that loan for quite some time. Again, that was discussed last meeting with in the general discussion of Cottonwoods. It was included in the global agreement that didn't end up going anywhere, and also pursuant to the interim agreement. To terminate that interim agreement, which is about the development of phase 2 with Steamboat Partners, they would need to be removed or otherwise removed as guarantors or released from liability thereunder. So this is, again, a concept that we have been discussing and generally understanding and agreeable for some time. The only change that I would request that I make to this document prior to sending it back to them is just a clarification in that section 6 regarding the infrastructure loan, that this indemnification of the guarantors of any payment due on the infrastructure loan satisfies the housing authority's obligations under the interim agreement regarding removing them or otherwise removing their liability, so that there's no question that we have satisfied that component of the interim agreement and can formally terminate that at the appropriate time or through the appropriate means. I sent a memo along with the document, which said mostly the same thing as this. I am, as always, available for questions.
All right, I'm sure we have some questions. Who'd like to start?
So George, I'm glad you brought up that infrastructure loans. That was one of my questions. So you're gonna add something in there that makes it real definitive that they're no longer part of phase 2. That the choice we can move forward with that project is completely free and clear, or do we have to have another contract? You said terminating something, or what's the steps towards solidifying the new agreement? Or do we need one, or?
And I didn't realize my camera was off. So to clarify, the interim agreement says that to terminate our joint relationship, one of the conditions is that the guarantors be removed from as guarantors or released from liability thereunder. All I'm proposing with this is that a clarification in the unanimous consent that this taking on the indemnification obligation is satisfies that release from liability language in that document. There is in the interim agreement and termination thereof also the issue of the plans for phase two and potential payment by the housing authority. Discussed that before. We think the Steamboat Partners has already been reimbursed from the joint venture for that. But to answer your question specifically, my intention would not be that this unanimous consent terminates that relationship. For one, the apartment joint venture is not a party to this, so it just from a technical legal perspective, it's a little weird. My point is that this clarification in the unanimous consent removes any hindrance to us terminating the interim agreement at any time that we want.
Okay. And then also just to clarify, and I think you know the answer, but I just want to clarify that this unanimous consent agreement in no way will add further encumbrances to phase two. It's going to be paid for out of the proceeds from the sales, correct?
The line of credit is a
Yeah.
obligation of the condominium JV and will be secured by a second deed of trust against lot one, the condo company or the condo lot. So this does not add any additional encumbrances against lot two whatsoever.
Okay. And the sales prices are set at the lower amounts after we got the 10 million, thank you, Steve, SDR fund investment. So regardless what happens on this 4 million, whether, it needs more, less, whatever, it's not going to impact the sales prices, correct?
This document does not modify or change anything about the reduction in prices from the receipt of the short-term rental funds.
Okay.
Any other questions of board members in the room?
Yeah, George, with this document in place, are we still gonna need the global agreement with the Lone Tree?
Well, yes, I mean, one, we need to figure out where the 5 million is coming from and address how that's going to be handled. There's a couple other smaller items like project surety and whatnot in the global agreement. So yes, I believe this is a first step, and yes, I believe we'll need other agreements with Steamboat Partners in the future. This is not the end of this sort of discussion. This is so that they are protected in terms of making that infusion and that we acknowledge that it's a line of credit. That's really all that this is doing.
Thanks.
Other than the
Right.
infrastructure loan, obviously.
Does anybody online have a question? Please raise your hand. Seeing none, we'll come back to the board members in the, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead. George,
Can you see the question, George?
In the chat. Yeah, can we please restate?
And can you read it for everyone in the room?
Michael Ann says, George, can you please restate what this agreement means for how if we have to proceed with Steamboat Partners for phase two? Sorry, home with a sick baby, hard to come off mute. So Michael Ann and others to clarify or restate. So with that modification that I was just discussing with respect to the infrastructure loan, we can terminate any further relationship with respect to phase 2 and Steamboat Partners at any time. I imagine that formality will occur with, well, let's not even call it the global agreement anymore, but some subsequent agreement when we figure out the second half of this funding gap and get the final piece in place. Does that answer the question? Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Are there any further questions? If not, I will ask for a motion to approve of the unanimous written consent of the members of Mid Valley Condominium LLC.
Subject to revisions pursuant to
Subject
George.
to the revisions that were made prior to the meeting.
Well, subject to the revisions George is talking about.
And subject to George's revision.
Wait, what revisions were made prior to the meeting then?
Oh, there were some, does this include, Mark's clarification?
He had a couple extra words that I'll probably include most of, and my revision regarding a one sentence that this satisfies the obligation under the interim agreement conditions.
What were Mark's words?
He wanted a number. He wanted a number in there for the amount of the construction loan, and I believe he wanted effective date defined, and those are both fine
Okay,
in my opinion.
I guess, yeah, can we get and I guess on those amounts, since we're, putting additional things, if you could send the revised contract out to the board so we see it.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you very much.
All right. Any further questions? Then I will entertain a motion.
Made a motion.
Yeah,
Oh, Lou, you,
yeah, with,
and do I have a second?
Second.
And Lou's motion was with the revisions that Mark did.
revisions that Mark.
With revisions that George
George.
and George put in. Just
I have a motion by Lou and a second by Maddie. Any further discussion on the motion? If not, I'll call the question. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries unanimously. A unanimous consent. Thank you.
Probably unanimous.
Yes, just like the title says. All right,
Thank you all. Have a great meeting.
there are
Thanks,
several.
Thanks, George.
Steve, myself, and Elliot are going to leave. And Lou, if I can have you take over.
Yep.
And the next item is the Cirsa presentation.
And it is,
Yeah, I can jump in here and just kind of introduce Sam.
okay,
But if you guys want to see what Florida looks like, it's not warm. So I just wanted to introduce you guys all to Sam White. He is the executive director of Cirsa, which is our insurance company. And so Sam has been gracious enough to put together a customized training for board members related to their legal obligations as a board member, and also how to stay out of trouble. That's ultimately what our insurance company really cares the most about. So I'll thank Sam for being here, and take it away, Sam. You've got, I think, an hour and a half worth of our time.
All right. Thanks very much, Jason, for that introduction. Madam President, board members, thanks very much for inviting me to participate. And thank you also. I was going to drive up, but I've gotten a little skittish as I get older and driving in horrible weather. And if you watch the Broncos game, you got a sense of, well, you live with it all the time, but it makes for pretty treacherous driving around here. So thanks for allowing me to participate virtually. I think I need to share my screen, so I may need staff's help with that to become a presenter. So if someone can go
You
ahead.
should be able to do it.
Okay, let's give it a try here.
Okay.
It's-
So as you're getting that squared away, we have lunch over here if anyone wants to grab lunch. So if you could give us like 5 minutes.
That would be great. Yep, I'll just sit tight. I'll get the slides queued up and then somebody just give me a yell whenever you're ready to get started. And just double checking with Elliot or Jason, can you see my slides on your side now?
Yeah, we got you.
And I'm change it to presenter mode. How's that? Still there?
Yes.
Looks good.
All right. All right, you just let me know whenever you're ready to get started.
So great. I'm just thinking about that slave left. Then I wasn't then on. Let's just go down. See tax. And so it's.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. That's sweet. So we get that in and then stop that because I think that'll go down, you know, an option. But there's a flurry of them. So I'll work about one. Good, just to be quick, yeah. So while I was just thinking of the US town. So they're gonna still do. Yeah, this one. Anything else I see when I go to work? This by phone. Legislating, yeah, that's awesome. Throws in together and that been hoping to give it out by his meeting. She got slumps that work. And she's in that account. I think it's just a whole sort of. So one of the.
That's not the first time.
Yeah. I think professional. Yeah, so, okay, good. So you guys sleep.
I saw you got some new reviews.
So now she can use the opening ceremony. Yeah. They do. Okay, good. Eat that Atlantic.
First off, she wears welcome and back.
Right.
They do a big fancy dog.
And then they get rid of it. They go big. I think it's just those. So you don't think right. It's what I was wondering.
What's in your mouth?
When they have them, they just open their, yeah, I think. The good one. The cool one.
Well, Kappa does the actual competing. For this, but. I don't know. I think I like to buy them.
Are you getting a bunch of gold plates, you know, Mom? Absolutely.
Just so I don't. I had a so that's a pretty good deal.
Well, very, congratulations, like a week, very, she's more popular, yeah.
Well, technically not. Country, don't have a few ones, that's the. Yeah. My sister's like been in Europe for 8 months, so she's like, no, you're fine. Like, yeah, because she's just doing a bunch of work. Okay. Serbia right now.
As we're waiting, I just wanted to say, Not gonna have a development team meeting on Tuesday, which is tomorrow. We're gonna be spending some time, I guess, in March, talking about the team. What I will do is I'll send out a document that identifies where we are relative to our strategic plan for 2025, at the end of 2025, and an update on all the strategic projects that.
So everybody ready for Sam to get started?
Yeah, I think so.
All right, Sam, take it away.
All right, thanks very much. So again, my name's Sam Light, and I'm the Deputy Executive Director and General Counsel for an organization called Cirsa, which is actually an acronym for the Colorado Intergovernmental Risk Sharing Agency, which is kind of a mouthful, which is why we call it Cirsa. So as Jason mentioned, we're your insurance provider. We provide your property and casualty coverage for the authority. So as an entity, we provide your insurance coverage for your buildings, your equipment, vehicles, those kinds of things. That's the property side of the coverage. And then on the liability side, we provide everything from liability insurance for slip and falls, personal injury type claims, everything up to, and perhaps what's of most interest to you all as members of the governing body of the authority, is we provide your public officials errors and omissions coverage for you all as public officials in Colorado. So a little bit more about Cirsa before I jump into the presentation for you all. So Cirsa is not a commercial insurance company. We are a Colorado public entity self-insurance pool. So we're owned and controlled by our members, and our only book of business is insuring Colorado cities and towns and affiliated entities like housing authorities, urban renewal authorities, and other types of entities. So we've been around since 1982. We have 295 entities that participate in our pool. You all have been with the program since 2010. You've been a member of Cirsa, so thank you for your longstanding commitment to Cirsa, and we value and appreciate your membership in the pool. One of the things about being a public entity pool is that, unlike commercial insurance carriers, I think it shows a different approach to how we deal with risk management. Just like you all, as the governing body of the authority, are doing the things locally to protect the interest and assets of the authority as an entity, then we as a pool kind of aggregate that up and view that we have a shared responsibility, right? We're all dealing in public funds and public projects, public interest, and we have a mutual commitment to risk management to make sure that we're doing the right thing always and that we're proactively thinking about risk. So part of the services that we provide at Cirsa is to visit with our members. We do training at all levels of the organizations that we insure, but the part that I do along with our executive director and associate general counsel is we provide training for the governing bodies of our members, whether it's a city council or a town board, or an authority board like yourselves, to help think about risk management at the highest levels of the organization, and also think about best practices for governance as board members that'll help you succeed, and at the same time also help you manage risk, right? So you can learn more about Cirsa at www.cirsa.org, and you can find some resources there. Staff did distribute this morning, I think, one additional handout that I'll mention as I go through the material. So I want to make our time together as useful to you all as possible. So if you have questions as I go through my material, please feel free to interrupt me. I'll try to keep my eye on the chat, but if somebody spots it before I do, please let me know that, and we can deal with questions in the chat as they come up. So I'm going to talk about, though I am an attorney, I style the presentation mostly around suggestions around risk management, and really suggestions for you all as governing body members of the corporate board of directors of the authority. Suggestions that I hope will help your effectiveness, both individually and collectively, while at the same time help reduce risk for you. So We're going to talk about the role of being a public official, how that translates to some expectations and risks. We'll talk about transparency rules, mostly the open meetings law. Talk about organizational structure and liability, and then a little bit about ethics and personal conduct. So again, feel free to ask questions as we go through. I'm happy to take those questions, but I have two disclaimers. The first is, though I am an attorney, just remember this is not an attorney-client discussion. This is a risk management presentation. And then second, I've been doing trainings a long time, and I'm happy to take any questions, but I do have a really good radar, I think, for what I call the live one, right? So if your question, well, you know how it goes. Maybe, you know, sometimes I'm in a training and someone says to me, hey, Sam, I've got a question. You know, what if another member of the city council does this? And everyone's eyes open wide, you know, it sounds like it's going to be a pretty exciting discussion. That's when my radar is telling me that that might be kind of the live burning issue, you know, that you've got going on right now, for which you actually need legal advice from your entity's own attorney. So I'll sense that, and I'll let you know that I probably have to beg off those kinds of questions. I can still give you some suggestions from Cirsa's perspective, but if you need legal advice in the here and now, that's from your authority attorney. Same thing if your question maybe isn't the legal one, but it relates to something that's in your staff's wheelhouse, your executive director's wheelhouse. I'll spot that as well. So I understand in getting prepared for this that you probably, I know my screen's a little small, it's hard to see you all in the room, but kind of have a mix of somewhat newer and then somewhat more veteran members. Is that right? So who's been on the authority board for, let's say, less than 2 years? Just trying to, I see a hand or two go up. And then who's in that 2 to 4 year range? All right, very good. So no matter how long you've been on the board or how long you've been involved in public service at the local government level, I hope you find my presentation helpful. So let's dive in. As I mentioned, I organize things around suggestions around risk management. So this first one may not seem like a risk management suggestion, but it really is, right? Do you all, I'm going to, again, look in the room and see if the hands go up. Do you all agree with this notion that once you become a member of a public body, once you become a public official, which is what you are as a housing authority member, once you become a public official, do you agree that your role and relationship to the community changes a bit? Everybody agree with that? Yeah, absolutely, right? Right? You know, in the eyes of your constituents, in the eyes of the people in the know, you know, in the eyes of the people who are following the work that you do as an authority, to them, you're always a government official, right? I mean, absolutely have a personal life and enjoy it, but recognize, right, in the eyes of people who follow your work, they're always going to perceive you to be a representative of the governing body, a representative of authority, of the authority. And that really is, from a certain perspective, a 24/7 job, right? You know, particularly in smaller communities, you know, you may be out and about on a personal errand, but somebody who's following the business of the authority, they bump into you, and you know, you thought you were just over there at City Market doing your own personal thing, but somebody comes up to you and wants to talk to you about something going on at the Cottonwood Project or Brown Ranch. So from that perspective, was the hat ever off? Never was, right? So just keep that in mind, because, you know, as they should, your words, your deeds, your actions matter as public officials. They definitely have an influence. They definitely leave an impression and create perceptions, and they can definitely have an impact as well, particularly when you as the board of directors take action that affects people's property or their business interest or so on. So just keep that in mind. Recognize also that another part of the change in roles is you're no longer an outsider, right, to government or governmental authority. You're now an insider as part of this quasi-public entity that is the housing authority. And the dynamic shifts because as an insider, you all know this, right? The rules stick to us as insiders, right? Whatever those statutes are or regulations that apply or bylaws that apply to how we do our business, we're bound to follow those rules, whether we personally like them or not, right? Recognize also that you're fiduciaries of the organization, right? Particularly at the governing body level, part of the role is to be a good representative and ambassador of the organization, but in the legal sense, you're also a fiduciary. And we all know what that means, but the fiduciary role, as I kind of define it, is, remember, it's that legal obligation to put the interest of the entity that you serve as a fiduciary, that is the authority, right, above all other interests. And that's not easy all the time. I don't know how often this is, but, once in a while, you're going to have meetings where maybe the room is full and maybe a somewhat controversial decision, maybe emotions are running high. People are really passionate about what they want you to do, but there's definitely differences of opinions about what you should be doing as the authority. So remember in that moment, right, that it's probably a good reminder that in those moments, you're probably going to have to make a decision and it's not going to make everybody happy, right? And people may be trying to tug you in different directions. You know how it is. Maybe somebody stands up during public comment and they say something like, hey, authority members, do this, and the next person stands up and they say, no, do exactly the opposite of that, right? Well, at that point in time, a good risk management tool is to step back and remember your fiduciary responsibility, and particularly around the policymaking decisions that you make. Perhaps one of the most critical ways of looking at your job is to understand that the protection of the authority's interest in assets is one of your most critical functions, right? And that in making decisions, particularly on policy, think of that broad role that you have, right? What is the right thing to do for the authority as an authority? And that'll serve you well, right? It's not true with a lot of the claims we get, but some of the claims that we get that challenge decisions by governing bodies, and you may never see this, but once in a while we do have claims where someone's challenging the decision of a housing authority board or an urban renewal authority board. And sometimes in retrospect, it becomes clear that the decision that was made was either made in haste, right, or made on less than good information. So as fiduciaries, one of the risk management tools that I recommend to you is make sure you take the time you need and you get the information you need that'll help you make good decisions that serve the interest of the entity, right? Sometimes that can be a bit frustrating if people are wanting you to make a decision, right now, today, at today's meeting or what have you. But if you as board members feel like you need more information from Jason and his team, or maybe you've got legal questions for your attorney, right? If the board's not comfortable acting yet, then it's definitely the board's prerogative, right, to slow things down and get the information it needs, right, and take the time it needs to have good deliberations and make good decisions, and that'll serve you well around risk management issues. Okay. Recognize also, you probably don't do this, so I'm going to again squint at the picture of the room. You don't actually take an oath where you stand up and like they do when you're elected city council member or something like that. But you actually do, once you become an appointed official, you basically make commitments that are akin to an oath of office, right? You make a commitment to respect the boundaries and allocations of responsibility that you have as directors of the authority. You make a commitment to lawful conduct, right? That includes following the applicable laws that apply. You made a commitment to ethical practices, right? They're right there in state statute and bylaws, and we're bound to follow those. And this last one may not sound so much like an oath type of commitment, but the last bullet on the slide, I think, is a significantly important one in terms of doing good work as a multi-member public entity, right? Because we each step up and we agree to become a member of the board of directors, but we have correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you've got 13 directors, right? And we're each contributing our own individual perspectives and viewpoints to an issue. But at the end of the day, right, it's a collaborative job by which we contribute our one voice in view of influencing and helping make the voice of the board as a whole. But at the end of the day, the board speaks with one voice, right? And we take action with one voice, whether it's by a split vote or unanimous consent. So I think part of the job then requires that we have a commitment, to professional courtesy and respect for each other as we do our collaborative work as a board of directors, right? That when we have deliberations and debates as authority members, no matter how much we disagree, we agree to disagree respectfully, that everyone feels like when it comes time to deliberate, each person feels like they have equal opportunity to add their voice, that your deliberations are a safe space, that we're actively listening to each other, and that we're having respect for each other's divergent viewpoints, even if ultimately we disagree with a particular person's viewpoint on a policy issue. So those are kind of important aspects of being local government leaders and getting your work done effectively and collaboratively. Okay. Next slide here. It's true for everybody, I think, in public service, but particularly for the folks at the top of the organizational pyramid who are on the governing body, right? And that is part of the job is to deliver good governance on behalf of your corporate entity, right? And that includes, I think, the way I've organized this slide is that it really comes down to committing to some core civics principles, right? And if you commit to those core civics principles, and I think by and large, the related liability issue that we deal with at Cirsa tends to take care of itself. So to illustrate, for example, commit yourselves as a board to openness and transparency, and you'll have few, if any, disputes, claims, litigation over compliance with the open meetings law or the open records law. We're going to talk more about that in a minute. Commit yourself to fundamental fairness, right? You don't have a lot of these types of decisions, but if you have decisions where individuals come in front of you and you have to make a specific decision that affects their property, you want to make sure you're making those decisions through a fair process, right? And you also want to make sure you're applying your rules and your standards predictably and even-handedly, right? It sounds like a boring part of the job, but when people come in front of you as the board of directors with a request, if it's a request you see multiple times, people who are in the same situation, they want to feel assured that the board, right, is applying the rules in a predictable and even-handed manner. That any decision that affects somebody who feels they're in the same situation as anybody else feels like they're being treated fairly, that the rules are being applied the same way every time, and that the rules aren't being applied arbitrarily, right? And those are all the flip side of legal risks that we see. So for example, if you have rules that apply to your decision making, but you go off script and don't follow your own rules, or you make a decision for some arbitrary reason or some reason that's not consistent with your own policies or state statute, then someone can challenge those on a legal basis as either being arbitrary or beyond your authority or not authorized by law, right? Okay. And then just like the last slide, last bullet here may not sound like a risk management principle, but it really is. And that is, as the authority's leaders and as part of your leadership, commit yourself always to civility and mutuality of respect with each other, with citizens that come in front of you, with your staff. It'll pay dividends in spades. I know in this environment, sometimes it seems like incivility is on the rise, right? I hope you don't face situations where people are showing up at your meeting with the professed intention of being incivil or disrupting the meeting, but just recognize that sometimes the job may ask of you, right, to make sure that we stay committed to civility even in the face of incivility. But you're definitely up to the task, and just keep an eye out for that. I'm happy to answer any questions if you have issues around public comment periods or have difficulties in that area. So, okay, unless there are any questions on those kind of introductory comments, I'll pause for a minute. Let's pivot and talk about transparency laws. And I'm sure you've been coached by your staff on this issue, but one of the things we do at Cirsa is we provide some coverage for members for defense of open meetings law violations, but it's a small amount of coverage, and it's only for defense of alleged open meetings law violations by the governing body. But as you well know, right, in the public sector and in the work that you do, there's definitely citizen expectations around transparency, and there are statutes that require you do your work mostly, right, in public meeting settings, right? So you've probably been coached on this before, but let's briefly go through the primary rules under Colorado's open meetings law. So the open meetings law basically says that whenever 3 or more members of the board want to meet to discuss public business of the authority, that's a meeting that has to be open to the public. We all know that, right? Additionally, the second major prong of the open meetings law is if the board is going to take any kind of action, you can only take action at a duly called and noticed public meeting. And of course, your staff takes care of the notice and so on. But recognize, right, that a board of commissioners of a housing authority can only take action as a board in a public meeting, right? And so you can't take action outside of a meeting or without notice. You can only take it by getting in the room together, or electronically if you allow for meetings electronically, and you take action collectively in an open public meeting. Okay, so those are 2 basic rules. A couple of twists on that. Sometimes folks ask, well, what if we just want to, go out for coffee? 3 or 4 members want to go out and have coffee together as a social gathering, right? So the state open meetings law does not apply to purely social gatherings, and it also doesn't apply to chance gatherings. So, even if 3 of you bump into each other at Creekside, some governmental watchdog does not automatically and immediately have a winning open meetings law claim by, pointing at the 3 of you and saying, aha, there they are. There's the members of the authority, talking about authority business again in some sort of secret meeting, right? Doesn't apply to either social gatherings or chance meetings, but only so long as you don't, right, allow those social gatherings or chance meetings to become, right, a gathering at which you are discussing public business, right? So we got to self-police on that issue. Be careful of that issue, okay? It really is a rule of 3. So the openness requirement applies when it's a discussion among 3 or more members about the merits or substance of some authority business. It doesn't apply to a one-on-one discussion. So 3 or more rule applies, one-on-one, the openness requirement doesn't apply. But what do you think of this dynamic? What do you think about a meeting that's one-on-one on one-on-one on one-on-one, right? So they got a lot of names for that kind of thing. This has been a very hot topic in our world around claims. That's the idea of a serial meeting or a daisy chain meeting where people are meeting, one-on-one on one-on-one at a time, and basically determining how to vote or having discussions in terms of working everything out in advance, right? So that by the time you get to the meeting, it's a mere rubber stamping of some discussions or decisions that have already happened outside the meeting. That would be a problem under the open meetings law as well. So we all intuitively know that that's not proper, and we're going to avoid that sort of conduct, but just make sure we understand that alleged serial meetings are also a very hot topic in the claims world, okay? Recognize that a meeting for purposes of the open meetings law includes any kind of gathering in person, like you're doing there in the room. It also includes any kind of gathering by phone, right, or by electronic means, which is why your staff, right, has coached you and trained you on the idea that if you get an email, like I think you got an email this morning with the packet material, or yesterday with the packet material, you don't want to hit reply all and begin having discussions among 3 or more members of the board, right, about the agenda items, because now you're having the discussion outside of the meeting, right, rather than in the meeting, okay? And you all know there's a notice requirement as well. Staff takes care of that on your behalf. So are there any initial questions about those basic concepts of the open meetings law?
Yeah, Sam, how about the distribution of information?
Yeah,
Just, I'd like you to review these things, sent to members of the board. Setting up meetings, like, is everybody available to meet, next week? That kind of a thing.
Yeah, so the state legislature a couple of years ago jumped into all this and established a couple of clear safe harbors for the use of email. One of them is that FYI only email. Another is if the emails only concern scheduling and availability, that's okay. The other, there's two more, and I'm going to forget one of them, but the other one is responding to a constituent and copying your fellow authority members is also fine. But you see in all three of those examples, what's not occurring is a discussion among three or more members, right? So here's an example where the danger can arise. Let's say one board member, we're working on some updates maybe to one of our strategic planning objectives, and you read a newspaper or magazine article about another housing authority, but to borrow from earlier today, let's say it's the Jackson Hole Housing Authority, and you read an interesting article about that, and you say, okay, I'm gonna email this FYI to my fellow board members. But you actually have on next week's agenda a discussion of the same type of strategic policy issue. There's no danger and there's no open meetings violation in just sending the article FYI. But where people can inadvertently walk into an open meetings problem is if somebody responds back and says, oh, the interesting article, I think we ought to revise the text of our strategic objectives and policies to reflect this. And then two other members jump into the fray and say, no, I don't like that language. Let's do this. What's going on at that point? All right. And you're now having a discussion via email. So sending FYI is fine. I think one of the ways you can also sort of monitor and self-regulate on this is make sure you include your executive director on the FYIs, or even better, let them do the FYI distribution for you, right? So that then the executive director says, well, here's an FYI item. We're going to discuss this at our next meeting. But if anyone has any, individual question for staff or to get ready for the meeting, send it to your executive director who can sort of monitor that traffic and help keep you out of harm's way, right? And they may, if they are watching the emails and all of a sudden it appears that we have three or more people on a thread having a, substantive deliberation about an issue, they can help throw the yellow or red flag that says, hey, wait a second, let's not, a reply all here and continue this discussion because we're treading towards an open meetings problem if we continue this discussion online, right? Is that helpful?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, you bet. So that actually dovetails nicely into my next slide, which is just to point out some ways you can break faith with the open meetings law, right? If members of the governing body are exchanging emails to debate the merits or substance of a policy issue, that could be a problem. If they're holding meetings before the meetings, that's also going to be a problem. The way the law really looks at this issue is, if the evidence comes in that what's happened at your meeting is a mere rubber stamping of some decision that was clearly arrived at through one-on-one discussions or some type of discussions outside of the meeting, then the courts are likely to hold that that's a rubber stamping in violation of the open meetings law, right? More from citizen expectation standpoint, the last two bullets here to remind you, the policy statement in the state statute, right at the beginning of the Colorado open meetings law, says it's the policy of the state of Colorado in a matter of statewide concern that the formation of public policy is public business and may not be conducted in secret. I think the most interesting word in that quote there is the word formation, right? It's not final vote or final announcement, right? The open meetings law is intended to give your constituent citizens a window into your deliberations. It doesn't mean that they necessarily have a right to comment on every single matter, but they have a right to observe your discussions and deliberations about how you make policy at the governing body level, right? So make sure you're not subscribing to any sort of parallel process that could create problems for you under the open meetings law. All right, let's keep going. So as the question hinted at, do you all have authority issued email addresses, or do you all use your own personal email addresses for your business?
I think it's mixed.
Mixed.
Mixed, okay.
Yeah,
All
Sam,
right.
generally speaking, everyone has their own personal email, many of them for the purposes of just kind of containment of YVHA business email have often set up like a, you know,
Yeah,
XYZ at, or, dot YVHA at Gmail or something
right.
like that. Um, so, but no, we do not like through our own email server,
Okay,
distribute out like, board member emails.
okay, okay. So recognize because that open meetings law says a meeting includes gatherings convened electronically, recognize again that email can be subject to the open meetings law, right? If three or more members are discussing authority business, the merits or substance of the authority's policy matters by email, then that can be an open meetings issue. Separate from that, recognize that under Colorado law in general, the emails that you send or receive wearing your hat as an authority member, those are by and large public records, right? Available to anyone who makes an open records request to your staff. It's absolutely true. There are some exceptions. Confidential communications, for example, maybe you get a confidential attorney-client memo from your attorney, right? That wouldn't have to be disclosed if you got that by email, right? And there are other exceptions, but the foundational principle is that by and large, electronic communications of elected or appointed officials or public officials that relate to their work as public officials can be subject to Colorado's open records law. Okay, so a couple of suggestions around that, just to cut to the chase. The way I look at this is to remind public officials, don't say anything in an email that you wouldn't want to say in a public meeting, right? Or in my world, in our claims world, either have read back to you in a deposition, or in the world of public rough and tumble, have read in the newspaper, right? So be circumspect in your use of email. It's just fine to use a personal computer and personal email address if that's what you want, but recognize that if you're using your own personal device to write an email, but you're wearing your hat as a member of the authority board, right? It's not the device, right, that's used that helps determine whether or not it's a public record. It's the actual content of the communication. So if the content relates to your job duties as an authority member or relates to the funds of the authority, then those can be subject to the open records law. Okay. And it's just fine. You have every right, to, if somebody reaches out to you by email, but they send it to your personal address, you know how it is. People know your personal email address. If you've set up your own separate address to help keep your private and public life separate, you can always tell that citizen, hey, please don't email me at my personal email address. If you want to communicate to the YVHA board or me as a board member, then email me at this other address. That's just fine. Okay. Question for you all, and I'm going to squint at the screenshot I have of the room. Is anybody active on social media as an authority member, board member? Not sure. Maybe. Yeah.
If you go on Facebook and
Yeah.
I say something,
Yeah.
is that as a member of the YVHA board, or is that as, here's my personal opinion?
It depends on a couple of things, but if you're making it clear that you're stating your personal opinion, then that's fine. It's your personal opinion, right? I would do it on my own personal site. I would make sure you set up the site so it doesn't have the trappings of looking like the site of a government official, right? And so that's ways to help protect against liability risk. As public officials, government officials, you're all subject to First Amendment principles where there's actually this thread of civil liability that if government officials have a government type website and they attempt to block content or remove content because they don't like the viewpoint being expressed, then that's a potential for a First Amendment liability, right? The U.S. Supreme Court a year or two ago clarified that the burden's a little bit higher than we first thought to actually prove that First Amendment violation, right? But nonetheless, if you're on Facebook and you're purporting to speak as an authority member about some issue in front of the authority, then my best advice to you is don't block or remove content. You know how it is. You may, with the best of intentions and good faith, put something out there on Facebook about what the authority is doing. And of course, you know, the first comment underneath that is some snarky thread or some personal attack, right? Well, my view of it is take solace in the fact that last time I checked, the statistics are there's over 500 billion social media posts a day. So something that's put on there in the comment thread that may make you mad and that you feel like you want to shut it down, just remember that that little snarky comment is going to be yesterday's news before we even get to the end of today, right? So just let that stuff roll off. You know, my suggestion is in managing your own accounts, you can have the comment thread either completely on or completely off. But as a government official, you don't want to be in a position where it appears that you're blocking or editing or removing content based on the viewpoint expressed by someone about some public issue that you're dealing with as authority members. Okay? That helpful with your question?
Think so.
Yeah, social media is a great tool for, you know, re-echoing or amplifying the positive, the great things that you're doing. But I'll just be frank with you on the view I've seen both in the, you know, claim world and non-claim world. It doesn't seem like the greatest forum for adjudicating the work that you do as a authority board, right? The best forum and venue you have for that is the public meetings that you have where the 13 of you get together in a room and you deliberate and you allow for public input, right? And that's a transparent and collaborative and supportive approach to doing things. It's just social media just is not set up for that kind of collaboration and transparency, right? Or frankly, you know how it is. A lot of people whose professed intention of getting on social media is just to attack or spread disinformation, right? So, okay. That also reminds me, if you see something on social media that, you know, it just gets your blood boiling, that it's complete disinformation about the authority or the work of the authority, I would suggest to public bodies and their officials and staff that you want to think real hard about, you know, who, when, and how are we going to combat that, right? I'm pretty sure that jumping in the fray and responding to a person who's spreading disinformation isn't going to change their mind necessarily, right? And it's probably just going to lead to another reply that's just going to send the whole issue further down the road, right? So if you've got real high profile and controversial issues, I would encourage you to work with your executive director and staff and think more about, well, what, to the extent we want to be transparent, we have the resources to do that. How do we do that collectively as an authority, speaking with the tools that we have for our own voice? So for example, do we put additional information up on our website, right? Do we do additional push notifications through staff of important topics, that kind of thing, okay? All right, I'll stop there unless there are any more questions about email or social media. All right. Other than to point out that the other handout that I think was sent out this morning was the one I intended to bring with me. And that's a one-page handout that talks a little bit more about what the law is around email, what the risks are around email, and then it's got some suggested do's and don'ts for you around email. All right. We've been talking mostly about the fact that you have to do your work in a public setting. But the flip side of that, of course, is that you are allowed to have executive sessions. But remember, under state law, you're only allowed to have executive sessions for a very limited number of authorized topics, and only after you follow very stringent procedures that regulate how you call and conduct your executive session. So from where you sit as the governing body members, I just recommend to you all, make sure you have staff there, your attorney or executive director, staff with you in the room before you go into any executive session to make sure you check all the boxes, right? Before you go into executive session. Because once you go into executive session, there's really no do-over from a liability standpoint, right? The law says that before you go into executive session, you have to make a public announcement where you announce the topic that you're going to have an executive session about. You actually have to reference the specific statute number, right? And you also have to disclose the subject matter that you're going to discuss in executive session. in as much detail as possible without compromising the purpose of the executive session. And in my world, in the claimant's world, I do have either governmental watchdogs or plaintiffs from anywhere around the state who listen to meeting recordings, look at agendas, watch videos, looking for technical violations, right? So the way to help us all collectively manage that risk is if you're about to go into executive session, but something didn't sound right, then any member of the board or anybody who's in the room, I encourage them to speak up and say, hey, did we get everything right? Did we make all the announcements that we need to make before we have an executive session? Okay. And use a script. You probably have a script, and I would recommend that as well. Okay. And then the other piece of executive sessions, of course, is make sure that you're protecting confidential information. And let me put on the screen here a scenario that helps kind of illustrate the confidentiality piece that comes with this. So you probably, is this right? As an authority board, I'll bet housing authority board, every once in a while, you probably have an executive session to develop a strategy for negotiating a purchase or sale. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. So let's say we're in executive session and we're developing a strategy for negotiating a purchase of a piece of property. It's perfectly legal to do that. You're allowed to have an executive session to develop strategy, to instruct negotiators, right? You're not allowed to have an executive session to make a decision. In fact, you can't take action in an executive session, but you can develop strategy and give instructions around strategy. So in this scenario, we're improperly called an executive session and we're developing a strategy to negotiate a purchase of land in hopes that we can purchase it rather than go through a condemnation proceeding. We've got a confidential appraisal with us to help us as the authority board, exercise our fiduciary responsibility and make sure we're offering what's an appropriate price. And in the executive session, we develop a strategy and we instruct that the chair and the executive director meet with the landowner and negotiate for a purchase price of up to $500,000. Well, human nature being what it is, and kind of excited to see if we can get this deal going. Maybe one of the board members the next day sees the property owner and tells the property owner, hey, we're willing to pay $500,000 for your piece of property, and we might go as high as $550,000 because the appraisal says it's worth that much. Do we have problems as a board under that scenario? What do you think?
Yes.
Yeah. Sometimes people call me at Cirsa and they say, well, what's the remedy for this? What are our legal rights and obligations? I would say if we're going to talk about that, first thing we ought to talk about is, well, who's the injured party in this scenario? Right? And it's probably the authority itself, but even more to the point, is it partially the board, right? You think about that member who let that confidential information out, that person's got to come back to the rest of the board and say, before the next executive session, do you trust me? Right? So it's absolutely the case that as legal fiduciaries of the corporate entity, right, you have an obligation as fiduciaries to protect the confidential information of the authority as determined by the authority board, right? And that's true even if you voted against going into the executive session, and even if you can't stand the idea of the underlying transaction. As a fiduciary and as a member of the board, you're obligated to protect the confidentiality of information. So it can be a little tricky, I recognize that. Like sometimes, particularly on these strategy discussions, sometimes in the executive session, you're getting a lot of background from staff to help inform your strategy. Where does this purchase sit in our hierarchy of priorities? In determining what we might offer, what's the budget look like, or what are our spending priorities? So, is that kind of background confidential or not, right? So a good tool that I recommend around managing this risk is before you break from executive session and you go back into the open meeting, maybe it's the president or whoever is leading the discussion. We ask ourselves as an authority board, we say, okay, before we leave the executive session, of all the confidential information that we've discussed during the executive session, which information, if any, leaves the room and who's our spokesperson, right? Now we're all on the same page about confidentiality, and we've identified what, if any, are the talking points that can be shared publicly, right? And the remedy, if you're a single member who didn't like that outcome, your remedy is not to leave the executive session and share confidential information. your remedy is to continue to discuss with your fellow board members, hey, isn't there anything more we can discuss? Particularly around negotiations, you might have several executive sessions, but you kind of collectively decide as a group what's confidential, what's not. If we're going to say anything publicly, what are our talking points and who's our spokesperson? Okay, 2 more risk points around executive sessions. This is an interesting thing about Colorado law. Except for executive sessions where you're having a conference with your attorney for legal advice, where the attorney is asked that you turn off the tape, there's an obligation under state law to record the discussion in executive session. And that recording is only held on to for 90 days, and then it can be destroyed unless your attorney says don't destroy it. So just recognize that when you're in executive session, the tape is, there's a recording being made. So just like a public setting, right? Professionalism, courtesy, still matter. Staying on topic absolutely matters. And that's the second reminder is in executive session, you have to limit your discussions to the topic that was announced in executive session. So make sure you self-regulate on that. You know, you might go into executive session for this negotiation matter, but you know, maybe somebody says, oh, okay, thanks, Jason, we've got our strategy worked out. Hey, but while we're in executive session, hey, attorney, can you give us an update on that legal proceeding that we got going on? If that was not part of the announcement for the authorized topics of the executive session, you can't do that. You can't mix and match topics. You can only have discussions on the topic that you announced publicly that you were going to talk about, okay? And then lastly, under leadership piece, when you come out of executive sessions, I always think it's a good idea to, you know, if you think it's necessary, maybe you make a public comment to remind folks that there was a reason for the executive session. Hey, we just had an executive session to develop a strategy around a purchase. We've got some strategy. We're going to go forward. Hey, if our strategy gets any traction, I just want everyone to understand and rest assured that if our negotiations ever get any traction, there actually is and will be a public notice and a public agenda item before we make any decisions, because you can't make any decisions in executive session. That's a good reminder to your constituents that executive sessions are in service of the best interest of the entity, right? Okay, let's keep rolling. Any questions around that stuff? Just some more practical stuff around meetings. I'm sure you have, somebody mentioned your strategic goals and you've got so many things you got going on and would like to do. Just remember that your agenda for any particular meeting actually, you know, sets the topics that you're going to spend your energy on for that evening. So be careful of either agenda creep or discussion creep, right? There's actually under the open meetings law, it says you shall post an agenda at least 24 hours in advance, and it shall include specific agenda information where possible. So just like you did earlier today, you know, when someone during public comment brings up a new item, right? You don't want to be taking action on that. Maybe it might require board discussion somewhere down the road, but, you know, bring it back at a time when it's an agenda item, all right? And then same thing with regard to your own discussions, make sure you stay on track on the agenda. And it's a thing that even irrespective of the legal issues is kind of holding faith and trust with one another and staff, because your agenda guides what everyone's prepared to talk about. It guides how we're going to focus our discussion. So, you know, agendas and meetings ought not to have surprise moments, you know, where we're trying to add items night of, right? And other dynamic in meetings, they ought not to have gotcha moments either, right? The way that might relate to public comment is, you know, gotcha moments. I hope you never have this, but we have plenty of Cirsa members that do face this situation. Your meetings ought not to have any, you know, staff bashing. You can't control a member of the public if they stand up and want to make a personal attack against one of you or a staff member. But, you know, imagine how powerful it is if we pivot away from that and say, hey, you know, our public comment is for people to address us as the board with comments that they have, you know, about the business we do. It's not appropriate to engage in personal attacks or what have you, okay? And then use and expect stability if you're having problems around that. So I'll just finish this portion up by asking, how are your public comment periods? They all seem to go just fine?
Yeah, they're okay. You know, take your 3 minutes and thank you.
We
Yeah,
don't have a lot of public comment. Most of the negative public comments are city council.
I have a
Yeah.
comment. A lot of times public sits there, and makes a comment.
Yeah.
And then they have to wait to the next meeting to comment on the committee. And some organizations have comments at the end of the meeting so that they hear what's going on and they can respond to that. Otherwise, you have to wait a whole meeting before you can make a comment on what you heard.
Well, I think we do it both ways sometimes,
Okay?
because what we've done is today we asked for public comment at the beginning. At our board meeting, we asked for public comment because we're going to go into executive summary. And then Kelly Phillips and someone else made some comments at the end. Essentially, what was the end? Because the
Yeah.
rest was the executive
I
session.
think that was really geared towards the agenda item. They didn't really comment on the agenda item. They veered off, but we.
No, they had nothing to do with the agenda.
Okay, but typically we allow board comment on agenda items also. And you can't control, I mean, if someone comments and veers off, what are you gonna do?
I mean, I'm also on the planning commission, and we have 3 minutes of public comment. And you just smile and say, thank you.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, and
that's-
you know,
And you're directing staff, I mean,
Yeah.
like we did today, because obviously want the public to be heard. I mean, if it's the case, like on a planning commission, when it's talking about a specific item, you say thank you, but like with something like today, you wanna have response back to the board of, what the status is.
Well, I think that was actually pretty good with, directing staff to respond to the gun guy.
Yeah. And then bring it back to the board so we know
Yeah.
the status.
yeah, we'll talk more about that, but that was a good example of, you got somebody showed up when to talk about an administrative matter, right? It's not on the agenda. So your staff is kind of taking notes on your behalf and you all confirmed that, well, okay, why don't you follow up with staff because it's primarily a staff issue, and then staff, when the opportunity is appropriate, then give us an update just so we know as board, right? So, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So back to the original question, I don't know if you have bylaws or local rules, but among our membership, I would say most of them have that, public comment for items not on the agenda at the beginning of the meeting. Some of them have an opportunity both at the beginning and at the end. It's there's no state statute that drives that rule one way or the other. So it's primarily a matter of local preference and how you want to set up your own agendas and approaches to public comment periods. Yeah. Although I would say 3 minutes is almost universally the number that we hear in terms of that issue. So, and you're probably never going to face a liability issue around this, but just remember perceptions around the time rule. I suspect, you're probably pretty informal. And if someone goes over their 3 minutes, that's probably okay as long as they're wrapping it up, right? But you want to make sure if you're going to enforce the 3 minute rule that you do it consistently and even-handedly, right? So that you're never in a position where, the person who's saying the things we want to hear ends up getting 5, 6, 7 minutes. And then the person who's, Sam, the citizen, stands up and we don't like what he has to say and we end up shutting them down after, exactly 3 minutes. That's not a good look, irrespective of what the legal issues are, right? Okay. A couple other things. I don't know how what rules of procedure you have, but use your rules of procedure to help you get things done. In local government, you really don't need something like Robert's rules. A lot of your procedural issues can probably be resolved by just consensus. Your chair, looks around the table and says, "Is it all right if we handle the motion this way?" And that's probably good enough to get it done. One thing I would remind you of is that in local government, we definitely pride ourselves in being approachable, right? And in some sense, we're informal, but we want to make sure we're not informal to a fault. At the end of the day, you're the governing body. This is your business meeting as the governing body, right? So have little tips and tools, whatever they look like to you, to make sure you maintain some sense of formality. I think the biggest struggle we see is that people ask us for help with their bylaws or rules of procedure is you might be having a difficult conversation among the board, but then members of the public are trying to jump in, or people are shouting out from the back of the room, right? So just little tips like, well, you have to be recognized by the chair before you can speak, right? Or maybe is it an issue where we agree that each member of the board speaks once before anybody speaks twice? Those kinds of issues, right? I think are helpful to maintaining that sense of formality and helping you run your meetings efficiently. So, all right, any questions about meetings issues before I pivot and talk about organizational structure?
Yeah, I have one. It seems
Yes, sir.
like you get a good dialogue going between two people. And if you have a situation where one person can speak and then wait for everybody else to speak, and then you've lost the moment of the interaction of the other person,
Yeah.
how's that dealt with? Because it gets chopped up to the point where if you wait 5 minutes to make your response, and by that time it could be meaningless.
Yeah, I'm gonna leave that to your chair, you know. They kind of guide and look at that. There's no, it's sort of that balance. It's like among the dark arts that chairs practice so well is just kind of making sure they're managing the discussion so that everyone's feeling heard and recognized, right? And like they're on equal playing field. Also knowing when something's ripe. So, I couldn't tell you that it's kind of a one size fits all rule on how you approach that. Yeah. Sorry, I couldn't be of more help with that. All right, let's pivot and talk a little bit about organizational structure and liability. This is a little more in my wheelhouse as the liability person with respect to claims against public officials. So just recognize that one of the important risk management principles for everyone in a public organization, well, any organization really, right, is to recognize and honor their role, right? And that everybody recognize what their particular lane is and that they commit themselves to being effective within their particular role and lane within the organization. So let me start with the liability aspect. And I hope, I'm pretty sure this wasn't, and I hope it wasn't your first question to your authority's attorney when you got on the authority board, but here's a fair question, right? It's like, hey, I'm now a public official on a housing authority. Can I get sued and be held individually and personally liable, right? For something that I do or don't do as a public official? And the answer is, well, yeah, it's technically possible, right? But here's the good news. I want to start with your protections and then talk about some of the difficulties around that. So in Colorado, like all states, we have pretty strong protections to help encourage people to step up to public service like you've done. And what I'm talking about here primarily is whether someone can sue you and hold you individually liable under state law for something you do or don't do as a public official. So under our Colorado Governmental Immunity Act, as a foundational principle, you initially have immunity from most types of claims that could be brought against you, right? But beyond that, the statute says that the authority, and by extension, the insurance company, Cirsa, right, is obligated to defend you and pay judgments entered against you for acts or omissions as a public official. Great news, right? But like so many things in life, there's a bit of a catch to that. Those protections apply, right, as long as we're staying within the scope of our employment and not acting willfully and wantonly. So scope of employment is an important term. That's the phrase that's used in the statute. It sounds odd to you as a non full-time employee. You're thinking, wait a second, I'm not an employee. I'm a member of the board. For purposes of this immunity law, scope of employment is the phrase that's used, and it simply means understanding and respecting and staying within the authority and the role that I have as a board member, right? Which is distinct from the role of the executive director or distinct from the role of the HR director or line staff people. I think you have maybe a dozen employees, is that right?
Yes.
Somewhere around there, right? So it just requires that everyone at every level understand and stay within their job description, and as important, understand what what issue is not theirs, right? Where some role or obligation or authority has been assigned to someone else, okay? So the other piece of that is you're protected as long as you're not engaging in willful and wanton conduct, and that's a weird phrase, right? Willful and wanton is intentionally conduct that's intentionally undertaken, designed to injure someone's legal rights, and taken with reckless disregard for what their rights are. And I just call it, I got an even simpler phrase to describe it. I just call it bad stuff. And it really would be. But the way it comes up, we don't get many claims, but every year we get a couple of claims at Cirsa where some plaintiff is alleging that an elected or appointed official or some public employee was engaging in willful and wanton conduct, and they're suing for damages. The way that fact pattern usually arises is it's a elected or appointed official or public employee individually misperceiving that they have some governmental authority that they actually don't have, right? Throwing on that purported governmental authority, right? And doing bad things to people for the wrong reasons, okay? And it really would be bad stuff. It would be, I don't know, intentionally defaming someone, maliciously going after a business competitor or a political enemy wearing a purported cloak of authority to do so as an authority member or something like that. So we know what bad stuff is. We're going to stay far away from it. Okay. I think the more practical piece is the scope of employment, just understanding what responsibilities have been given to others and which ones belong with the board. As an example of that, just scope of employment, I pose a question like within whose scope of employment, within whose job description is it to, approve a contract, let's say, for a value of $100,000 or more? Whose job would that be? Is that the board's job?
Generally speaking, that's reserved for the executive director if it's within the budget.
Yeah. So like every entity that I've run across, you've got a purchasing powers, right? You have a purchasing policy, right?
That's correct. Yep.
Yeah. And so the purchasing policy was adopted by the board, and it basically says that above a certain level, it's the board's job. Below a certain level, it's the staff's job, as long as the funds have already been authorized in the budget, right? But we then also know that to the extent it's the board's job, it's no one member's job, right? Like you all know, does any single member of the authority board have the power to negotiate and bind the authority to a contract? No, right? It's the board collectively, right? So we're going to talk more about those concepts in a minute. So just staying at the broad themes, this all sort of begs the question, what's our structure? What's my job description as a board member? You all know this stuff, but you're great thing in Colorado is we have enabling statutes that allow you to form entities to put front and center as a top priority these community needs like housing, right? And you're allowed to, by law, form multi-jurisdictional housing authority. That's what you are. You're also a political subdivision of the state and a public corporation. You got a set of bylaws. Under all that structure, in terms of this concept about role discipline, what you've really set up in a certain way is you've got a structure where you have a board of directors, that's you all, and then you have a CEO. We just happen to call it the Board of Commissioners of the Authority and the executive director, right? So recognize under that structure, the board of directors, your primary role and function and job duties is to serve as the governing body of the organization, right? To be the corporate governing body with legislative authority, right? That exercises the policymaking and governance roles of the organization, right? And then your bylaws say that your CEO, your executive director, right, is your executive representative who is responsible for day-to-day administration and management. So although I don't hammer on it too much, like all public entities, you have a distinction between the policymaking roles of the board and the administrative functions that you've delegated or assigned to your executive director and staff below the executive director. You also have board committees, right? We've got a number of those, right? The board committees, are they primarily advisory, or do they have powers of their own?
Advisory.
Advisory.
Mostly advisory. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So those committees serve in an advisory capacity to the board, right? So if you're on one of those committees, part of the role discipline is also recognizing that at the committee level, yes, we provide guidance, we help formulate recommendations for policy, we put a closer eye and study to issues, but at the committee level, we're not yet ready to basically commit ourselves as an organization to a decision, right? Somebody mentioned you're on the planning commission somewhere, right? It's sort of analogous to that. You're a recommending agency, you're recommending committees. Sometimes in the public eye, they may think the decision's already been made when the committee speaks, but frankly, it's the board that still has to make final decisions, right? So in terms of this, with regard to governance and risk management, it all begs this question, sort of how I've shown it hierarchically. And that is, think about as board members, where do we as a board, what's our job, and where do we focus our energy and efforts, right? And I would commend you to think of it this way, both from a governance and a risk management standpoint, that the governing body primarily spends its time and energy in the top two tiers here, dealing with like the ownership issues, the needs and wants of our owners, right? Our community. If you think about it, right, it's the governing bodies, the part of the organization that's uniquely positioned to help determine the needs and wants of the community around housing, and then help determine how we put the governmental resources that we have available, right? How do we put those resources on that issue? That's a governance function, a policy function, a resourcing and empowerment function, right? So as the governing body, right, your role of corporate governance is tackling the big issues like policy setting, looking forward, looking down the road at your strategic goals, long-term housing plans. In terms of actual things that you do, probably your annual budget is probably one of the most important documents to you, right? Annual budget, not, the individual payroll of a particular employee for this week or that week, or or a specific expenditure that you've already put in the budget but delegated to your executive director, right? In some worlds, the corporate people call it establishing corporate limitations. That is the governing body. You're interested in the budget, the large decisions regarding assets and projects, long-term and strategic planning on your housing objectives and your housing programs and policies, right? And then appointment and oversight of the board's few direct reports that we'll talk about in a minute, okay? So I would encourage you in terms of looking both at risk and governance that the governing body and its members, you have that longest time horizon. You're looking at the big picture, not day-to-day operations, that you have the broadest interest of the organization and community in mind, and that you're working together as that 13-member board, right, to fulfill your fiduciary responsibility to protect the authority and the board as institutions, okay? So a couple ways to help support organizational structure and avoid concerns or risk issues around role, discipline, and scope is to make sure you understand the job description and stay within it. Look at the board powers and duties provisions of the IGA and your bylaws, and becomes apparent that says, well, as a member of the board, when I got involved in the board, here's the things that we do as a board, right? Make sure you respect the delegations of authority that you've already made by your bylaws or other documents to others. It's an important aspect of it because what it does is if you've decided through your purchasing policy, for example, that your executive director is responsible for contracts and purchases below a certain level of as long as it's in the approved budget, what you're really saying is that's not where we as the governing body want to spend our energy. We want to spend our time and energy on governance and policy and things that uniquely only the board can do. And you staff, if we delegated authority and responsibility for you to do it, then we expect you to do it on our behalf in accordance with the limitations that we've set in place. Okay. Recognize that the role of, as I mentioned earlier, is a group role, right? Sometimes there's a temptation to think, well, we got, can I ask to make sure I'm right? Do you have 13 members on the board?
Yes.
Okay. Sometimes there might be a temptation to say, well, we got a 13-member board, and I guess I own 1/13 of the power, so darn it, I'm going to go out and use it. Right? That's not the way it operates. Each member holds a fraction of the power, but it can't be exercised alone. The Housing Authority Board can only act collectively as a group. So that means, deliberate with many voices. Yeah, fight like heck for your voice to be heard. But when we take action, we take it collectively. The way it presents itself in my world is be careful of that dynamic. If we're thinking and acting in terms of I rather than we, that can be a red flag. I've had claims issues where the root of the claim is an individual who said, you know, well, you as a board do what you want to do. I'm going to go do something else on behalf of the authority. And that can be a red flag either for third-party liability for the organization or that there's trouble afoot within the governing body itself. Okay. So why is all this role discipline stuff important from a liability standpoint? Here's a couple of examples, real life examples. You have 11 or 12 staff members, right? Do we all agree that the board itself actually is not the direct supervisor of all 12 staff members? Yeah. And we've had claims occasionally where an elected appointed official who's clearly not the supervisor, right, gets ensnared in some personal issue or tries to make a personal decision that's not their job, right? That would be conduct that's outside their scope, right? And that's where some liability risks can arise. Or elected or appointed official interferes with an administrative matter that's clearly been assigned to staff, right? And then we're running into problems around that issue. Okay. So the last bullet I want to mention here is not necessarily, do you all during your board meetings, do you have an opportunity kind of free-flowing discussion afterwards where each member gets an opportunity to kind of give a report? A lot of boards do that. The chair will say, okay, does anyone have anything else to report before we adjourn? You know, something like that.
We start off with that.
With board reports?
Yeah.
A board
Yeah.
comment.
Comments.
Yeah, we may give committee reports or what have you, but be careful of this dynamic. Sometimes there'll be a dynamic that says, yes, Madam Chair, I've got something to report. Since our last meeting, I did this. And everyone's eyes open wide. All right. If that's a dynamic that's happening, my suggestion is it's a wise board that spots that issue and is willing to have the tough discussions around what are our norms and expectations around how we individually, right, do our work purportedly on behalf of the board or behalf of the entity in between meetings. And I mention it because you're already busy enough, but if you're volunteering to do something for the authority or the board in between meetings, want people to feel supported. Definitely don't want there to be potential risks or claims around those issues, right? And they can arise. I've had claims where people individually purportedly on behalf of a board have in between the meetings negotiated a contract or gave some direction to a vendor or some property owner who then claimed that they relied upon it, right? Or who went to some other governmental entity and purported to take a position on behalf of the authority board, but actually the authority board had not yet even talked about it. So those could all be warning signs. So just be careful of that dynamic. And it's only the governing body that can have those discussions and sort those issues out for themselves, right? Okay. Building on that theme, just recognize that for a multi-member governing body, right, I think that sometimes the job will ask of us as governing body members that sometimes we have to make a personal sacrifice in view of strengthening the board as an institution, even though we may not have preferred that particular personal approach, right? So here are some examples, right, of some personal sacrifices that being on a multi-member governing body of a public agency might require. Setting aside a personal agenda when there's lack of support, right? You may say, hey, I wanted to be on the housing authority, and the sole reason I wanted to get on there was because me and my people wanted to see this to happen. But if it's not a priority of the board and you can't find a majority of the board to come along with you, you have to be willing to shelve that personal agenda, right? Or personal interest in view of service to the work plan of the authority as determined by the authority board, right? I don't know if you ever have split votes. Do you?
Yeah.
Yes, we
Yeah,
do.
once in a while. So let's say you have one of those tough discussions and it's, it's a 7-6 vote, right? If you're somebody on the 6th side of that vote, is it okay to go back to your people and say, I didn't vote for that stinker? What do you think? Well, sure, I'm just the insurance guy. You can tell your people whatever you want to tell them. Okay. Far be it from me to tell you what to tell them, but they already know how you voted because it's on the public record, right? So the personal sacrifice might be, would the message be different if it was, well, I didn't vote for that one, but you know what? We as a board, we had a really good discussion around that issue. We had a lot of differences of opinion. I fought like heck from my point of view, but you know what? The board ultimately decided to go a different direction, and I respect the decision made by the board. Right? Because that's sort of admitting that in this world of public life, we're probably all going to win some and lose some at some point in time. But one of our fundamental responsibilities of being on a governing body is to help make the governing body, the institution, stronger. Right? When we leave the board, it's stronger than when we found it. Right? It can certainly have a risk dynamic. I've had situations when people were on the losing side of a vote, and they tried afterwards to go to staff and direct staff not to implement the decision, or they've gone to a third party and told them that that decision is going to be overturned, or they interfered with the third party's ability to recognize the benefits of the decision that was reached. Those all can even give rise to what we call in Colorado the tort of tortious interference, right? So yeah, you don't have to be the main cheerleader of a decision that you didn't like or vote for, but you do, I think, have to respect the fact that it was the decision of the body, okay? And recognize that your individual efforts, whatever they look like, maybe you're a liaison for the board, or maybe on a committee, or maybe you're volunteering your expertise and time in between meetings. Recognize that all of those things are in service of the collective interest of the authority as a whole. They're not in service of our own personal interest, right? And then lastly, we were talking about this. This comes up particularly with regard to social media. Sometimes I think a personal sacrifice that we're asked to make is just be attuned to, are we by our own actions, either in reality or in perception, are we creating perceptions either among the board or among the community that we may be getting ahead of, or purporting to speak for the voice of the board before the board itself has even had a chance to speak? Right? You know how that is. Going back to my earlier slide about 24/7 job, somebody comes up to you, at some event, and they say, hey, what's the authority board think about this issue? And your radar is going off and you go, well, I'm not sure, because we haven't had a chance to talk about it. But the citizen persists and they say, well, I get that. What's your opinion? Right? And you go, okay, I'll bite. But hey, again, citizen, this is only my personal opinion. This is only my personal opinion. And you go ahead and tell them, what are they perceiving? Fair or unfair, they're always going to perceive that you're expressing a voice on behalf of the authority. So be careful of that, right? Just recognize that the way it presents itself in risk sometimes is elected or appointed officials will call me and say, hey, have you ever seen any guidelines or bylaws that try to get ahead of the issue where it feels like we have one or more of our members who are trying to get ahead of the issue before we've even had our first discussion of the issue? And now, I thought next agenda was going to be the first time we we're going to talk about this issue, but I feel like I'm coming to discussion with one foot in a bucket because some of our members have already been trying to cast the issue one way or the other beforehand. That's really about dynamics of the relationship among the body. Okay. So any questions, thoughts on that? All right, last couple things, then we'll wrap up. In the risk world, getting back to the things that are more in my wheelhouse, around risk, adherence to organizational structure is particularly important in the area of employee relations and administrative matters that have been assigned to staff. Right? Recognize again that you as the governing body, you are not the supervisors of all employees. In fact, the board only supervisors, who are your direct reports as a board? The executive director, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, anybody else? Probably the attorney. But anybody else after that? Probably not. Yeah.
Basically.
Yeah, it's just the executive.
Yeah, so we got 9 or 10 other employees that are not supervised by the board. I will tell you from an employment practices liability standpoint, from your perspective, I would encourage you to say, phew, not my job, right? You have decided as an organization that we, as the members of the governing body, are not supervisors. We do not want that HR risk. Yes, we do have an HR responsibility to supervise, give guidance, evaluate the performance of our 2 direct reports, but that's all we're going to get involved in. And We don't want to make sure we're not getting individually and improperly involved in personnel or administrative matters. So, but I'm not naive. I was a public entity attorney for 25 years before I started working at Cirsa. I know this pressure can come, maybe some citizen, or vendor or somebody who's got a contract with you. They've got some issue. They feel like they had an interaction with staff that they didn't like. Their natural inclination is come to you and say to you, hey, board member, you got to do something about that employee, right? But what do you want to do with that? Right? If it's not one of your direct reports, you want to turn it over to your executive director and say, hey, this is your hot potato. This is your problem. And your executive director is going to say, okay, it's a personnel matter below my level of executive director. I'm going to get this together with the supervisors and we're going to take care of it, right? And to the extent you're involved at all, it would only be on a need to know basis, right? Same thing with administrative matters, right? If you've clearly delegated an administrative matter to your staff, then it's not that there's a lack of accountability. They're in fact, they're responsible for being accountable and doing the administrative work consistent with the parameters and direction that you've given, right? But you want to make sure that you're doing that in a way that's effective for the organization, right? So also commit to speak with one voice to your direct reports. You ever have that dynamic where you go around the table and somebody says, let's give Jason some direction. We go around the table and before we're done, we got 9 different views of what the direction ought to be. That's usually when the chair says, Jason, you got your direction, right? But who owns that issue? You as the board own that issue and you want to own it because you're the boss, right? But you got to commit to each other as board members to make sure you work out your own differences, right? It's the board's responsibility to work out its own differences among itself so they can speak with one voice to your direct reports. The most practical way I've seen this create risk issues is you have a messy discussion around the direction ought to be given to your attorney or your executive director. It's not resolved, but then after the meeting, individual members, you start dropping by the executive director's office and they say things like, hey, that was a messy discussion that we had the other night at the board meeting, but here's what I want you to do. That's not consistent with the we, right? And wouldn't you feel frustrated as an individual board member if someone who had who was doing the same thing, but from a 180-degree different view was doing that, right? So you got to make sure you commit to sort out those differences, right? Okay. On administrative matters, make sure you use your executive director as a resource. You are the eyes and ears of the authority and your ambassadors of the authority. But if it's an administrative matter that's been assigned to staff, then you want to turn that over to the administrator and let them do that work on your behalf. If someone comes to you with a question about administrator, use your executive director to help you get accurate information, help get information to all of you as board members collectively as concurrently as possible, right? And you may get a question about some administrative matter. The best way to approach that is in a way that makes everybody look good and get the information out so that shows that we as authority collectively are getting the work done in the appropriate way. So if a citizen sends you an email, they got an administrative question, you can send it on to your executive director. They look into it, they get the information to the citizen, they let you know they've done that. So next time you see that constituent, you say, hey, did we as an authority get you the information you needed? And hopefully it's a thumbs up, right? Make sure you're supportive of the administrative processes you're in place. It's absolutely true that the work you do as housing authorities, the work the public entities do, you're going to adopt policies that, sometimes create winners and losers, right? And sometimes people who feel like they're on the short end of a policy, what they're going to want to do is try to conscript you as an individual board member, right, into finding an end run around the policy, right? Or they're going to try and use you as an individual to open up some argument that the policy doesn't work. But a lot of times you spend so much time and effort as a board to put a policy in place. The last thing you want to do is when the first difficulty shows up under that policy is to say the policy is no good because you already put all the work into it, right? So be supportive of the policies and procedures that you put in place around administrative issues. Okay. All right. Ethics, we do separate trainings on ethics, so I just real quickly want to point out, make sure you know that you obviously have ethics rules that apply to you. You have some in your bylaws, and then there are some others under state law. Make sure that as board members, you find the appropriate resource and get a good working familiarity with what the rules are, right? Because that's how you can protect yourself against risk. A violation of state ethics rules is one of those situations where it truly is an individual personal liability that's not covered by insurance. So this is definitely one of those areas where you want to make sure you know what the rules are and you're doing the right thing in terms of following them, right? So the key areas, of course, are conflict of interest. If you have a conflict of interest, make sure you make an appropriate disclosure, right? If the board's going to take some action that affects your own financial interest, you have to disclose your conflict of interest. You have to recuse yourself from the board discussion and vote, and you have to refrain from attempting to influence your fellow decision makers. So make sure you take a close look at what constitutes a prohibited interest around that, okay? Are you required to leave the room after you make your disclosure? Do you know?
I'm not sure here, but I know in planning commission, yes.
Oh, okay. Yeah, for you as the governing body authority, I'm not sure whether your bylaws required or not. State law actually is silent on that issue, but I encourage folks, if you have a financial conflict of interest that requires you to step away as an authority board member, then I would encourage you to leave the room. Now, that's saying that unless your bylaws require it, I'm not sure you absolutely have to do that. But remember, another piece of the ethics rules is that you cannot attempt to influence the other decision makers, right? So it would be inappropriate to say, you know, I've got a conflict of interest because this contract that's on the agenda is a proposed contract, you know, with my company. You make a proper disclosure, you step away from the table, you don't vote, you don't participate in the board discussion. But what if you start answering questions? You know, the board members have questions of you, and all of a sudden it sounds like through your answers, you're attempting to influence the other decision makers, right? That too would be prohibited under the state ethics laws. So be careful of that dynamic as well. The practical way to avoid that risk is to let somebody else do your speaking for you if it's actually a decision that affects your interest and you feel like somebody needs to be heard with respect to representing your own interest, okay? There are state ethics laws around confidential information. We've touched on that issue before. And then we also have a constitutional amendment in Colorado that prohibits gifts to public officials. Just make sure you understand what those are. The most practical thing about gifts is obviously this. If somebody's offering you a gift and it appears to be connected to your role as a housing authority member, right? And it's would be clear that they're attempting to influence your decision or reward you for some decision, or they're trying to get you to depart from the fair and impartial discharge of your duties as an authority board member, then just decline the gift. And that's how you keep yourself in a safe place, okay? Last bit on ethics is just to remember this piece. You probably agree with this notion, you know, and it's just a difficult thing, no matter what we think of it personally, and fair or unfair in matters of ethics. Do you agree with this notion that, you know, a lot of times it's perception equals reality and reality equals perception, right? Yeah, the only practical tool I can give you in that regard is, let's say that you got a matter on the agenda and there was a question of whether you had a conflict of interest. So you spoke with Jason, maybe you reached out to the attorney, maybe even got your own separate advice, and you've concluded, I don't have any conflict of interest that requires I recuse myself. But nonetheless, you get to the board meeting and there still feels like there's this weird vibe in the room, you know, like somebody's sitting there in the audience going, hey, why is Sam sitting up there at the board table? I thought he had a conflict of interest, right? There's still this perception hovering in the room. I would encourage you at that time just to take it head on and make a comment on the record. Say, hey, Madam Chair, you know, before we start the discussion, I'd like to clear the air on something. I've heard some suggestions or some gossip that I've got a conflict and I need to recuse myself. I just want to let everybody know I've looked at that issue. You know, I don't have any financial relationship. I don't have any other relationship to this matter that requires my recusal. I just want to get that on the record, and I just want to make sure everybody understands that I'm going to make this decision the same as I would any other decision. I'm going to make it in the best interest of the authority, right? In accordance with whatever rules or standards or policies apply to this decision. And that's a nice thing to say. Of course, it's got to be true, right? But it shows the audience, the people who might still be holding that perception, right, that you're doing the right thing for the right reasons, right? And then last thing on ethics is, I hope I'm not speaking out of turn for your authority attorney, but if you are not sure, you're reading a future agendas and you're not sure whether this or that decision might raise a conflict of interest for you, your attorney and your executive director, they'll always appreciate getting a call early. Now, they're not your personal ethics advisor, but they can help you navigate what the rules are supposed to intend, right? And it's much better to reach out early and try and get some feedback and have a dialogue of whether the rules require disclosure. Much better to have that conversation as early as you can, rather than have it pop up in the moment, right there at the meeting where it's happening in real time, right? That can get a little messy and difficult, okay? All right, so that's ethics. I've got a couple ethics scenarios. Just in the interest of time, I'm going to leave them on the screen. I think if you look at your own bylaws on the ethics rules and you think about these scenarios, the answers become apparent pretty quickly about what the right course of action is to stay out of harm's way in these ethics scenarios. Okay. All right. With that, I'm going to kind of sum things up with a couple of concluding thoughts. Again, for you all at the top of the organizational pyramid to think about in terms of how do we do our work as board members to both do great things on behalf of the authority and also manage risk, right? Some broad themes to take away is embrace and provide good process. Recognize that as a housing authority, particularly around planning for projects and deliberations, et cetera, that part of what you deliver as the governing body is you provide process as a product in and of itself, right? Think about that. We provide a forum for people to come talk about their needs and wants, and then we make decisions as the governing body, and from your long meetings that that's a process. But embrace and deliver good process irrespective of outcome. Make sure you follow your transparency rules. As I said, if you feel like you're on the precipice of a difficult decision, but you're not sure you've had time to gather all the information you need or check in with your executive director or attorney on the issue, take that time and get the information you need. Make sure you have focused on point deliberations, even for things that are, we know are going to get approved 13-0. The public is expecting you to have deliberations before you take action. So it's always supportive of your good governance role to have good discussions before taking action. It can be very disconcerting and actually put government watchdogs on notice that if some issue comes up on the agenda and oddly enough, it just got approved with no discussion. Well, that's weird because I thought this was a pretty controversial topic. That's where people start wondering, well, maybe there was discussions that occurred elsewhere outside of the open meetings framework that somehow ran afoul of the open meetings law. So commit yourself to having good deliberations. They lead to defensible decisions. Remember your SOE, that's your scope of employment, right? Know by your rules, play by your rules, apply them even-handedly. Recognize that you act collectively as a we group as the board of directors and work to fulfill your fiduciary and stewardship responsibilities as a board of directors. So with that, I'll open it up to questions. Just want to point out that the remaining slides have some more resource links for you to Cirsa information and a little bit more information. So with that, thank you so much for the opportunity to meet with you all and present. I hope that was helpful. I'm happy to take any questions that you might want to chat about.
Anybody have any questions?
Just thanks, Sam. Good presentation.
Thank you, Sam.
Thank you so much, everybody. I appreciate it. Enjoy your week.
Take care.
Yeah. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Okay. That is our agenda. Does anybody has any other, anything you want to talk about?
Just a quick question. Did we get a press, did we send a press release or the OPG on the open house? tomorrow? Or this week?
I just posted on the, pages we have, so on 3 sites. Then, they, they said they posted it on their websites to each property, and I could not find it for the life of me. So Elliot reached back out and had them email it to us, but I didn't see it posted on their sites, and then I went to OPG, Lincoln Rock, and then all 3 properties, and I couldn't find it, so then that's when Elliot had me posted on Friday night. So
Lou, I wonder if we should send, if we should have, ask staff to send a press release, because, you know, I don't think anyone knows about, I haven't seen it on Steamboat Radio, see, it wasn't on Steamboat Radio this morning, and that's something Shannon would definitely post, and I don't think the pilot has it either, because we're doing an open house for the community. I mean, or just a press release. Pardon me?
there's no way Julia hasn't seen it yet.
Well, except for it's weird, it's not, usually they would do something on the pilot. I didn't, there wasn't anything, I know they don't do a Monday paper, so maybe it's coming out. But Shannon usually does something if she has it. So I just think in the spirit of transparency, maybe, you know, hope we, you know, we should send a press release. Just even if with this little, even if we just send out this, you know, graphic that we have this picture, just so we're being very proactive and letting the community know.
Okay, let me talk to Robin.
Okay, yeah, it's just a thought, because as I said, I haven't seen it anywhere public yet.
I mean, the only thing I've seen is what Sarah sent out.
Yeah, but, you know, open to the public. Public's gotta know about it.
Yeah.
And it's starting tomorrow at 10 a.m., so.
Okay. Okay,
But thank you for putting it on our social, Sarah.
Yeah.
So at least it's out there somewhere people follow us.
Do you want me to stop recording?
yeah, you can stop recording.
I guess we'll do a motion to adjourn. Yeah.
We don't need a motion.
Oh, it's just adjourned.
We don't,
Just adjourn it.
we just adjourned.